Harvard Conservation Trust Speaker Series. My name is Gina Ash. If you don't know me, I am with the Harvard Conservation Trust and I've lived here in town for over 20 years. For those of you who are new to HCT, we are a nonprofit land trust. HCT's mission is to preserve Harvard's wildlife habitats, water resources, and areas of ecologic importance. Harvard was settled very early in 1658. It is a place of scenic natural beauty with rich wildlife habitats and deep historic heritage. This includes our extraordinary stone walls. Tonight, we're excited to welcome Dr. Robert Thorson, Professor of Geology at the University of Connecticut and New England's recognized expert on stone walls. You may have read that he is the author of 7 books, including Exploring Stone Walls and Stone by Stone, The Magnificent History in New England Stone Walls. He is also the proud grandfather of 2 babies born during the pandemic. Thor, as he is referred to by family and friends that now include all of us, is also leading the Stonewall Initiative, an internet portal where he is building a taxonomy for stone walls so that we can actually look at the stone walls in our properties and help to understand where they came from and how they were put together. When we asked Thor, what should people walk away with from this time together, he answered very definitively, stone walls are the signature land formation of New England. They give us a sense of identity. When you leave our region, you lose our stone walls. Now, onto the mysteries of stone walls here in Harvard. Thor, over to you.
I always like talking about stone walls, and I can't get enough of them. I'd like to just ask you if you could imagine for a minute growing up in a place where you've never seen a stone wall or where you've never seen a tree. And when you walk by your first tree, you're not going to just walk by it and say, huh, it's a tree or it's something. You're going to say, what is that thing? That's exactly what happened to me when I moved to New England from Alaska. I was hired to teach the landscape archaeology and surficial geology. And I said, I better go have a look at these walls. And I started doing a traverse in the nearest state forest, and they were everywhere. And I became instantly addicted to the stone walls of New England in a way, because I had never seen them as kids. The first one I saw was probably under a Dunkin' Donuts when I rode the bus from Seattle to Portland, Maine on my honeymoon because I was a starving graduate student, leaving the money in the refrigerator. Having said that, that's a little bit long. Let me just get started on sharing my slide deck. I've got a slide deck and I walk through it with you. When I'm done, I'll handle as many questions as I can, and I'm in no particular rush to leave at exactly 8 or even 8:15. I'm good for good until you wear me out. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to share my screen and go to the slideshow and play from start. That should be it. Does it look okay, Gina?
Looks great, thanks.
Okay, good. Here we go. I'm going to try and shrink your image a little bit so that I can see the whole thing, or move it. There you go. Okay, Harvard Conservation Trust, and the bar for the talk is right in front of the subtitle that I had down there. So I can't read my subtitle, but let's not worry about that. Basically, am I really going to solve Harvard's Stonewall mysteries? I'm not so sure about that. Okay, so what we're going to do is go to the next slide. There. Let me start with the local mystery. With this particular wall that was sent to me from somebody in the land trust on the Gillette property. And the question is, why do we have both flat and round stones? Well, there's an answer. There is a selectivity by the ice sheet in the kinds of shapes that it makes, and there's a selectivity by the individual who built it for whatever reason. And I call these the glacial mix and the wall mix. There's also a bedrock mix. So what you see in the wall is a reflection of 3 selection processes relative to the bedrock in the land. There's a gap here in the stone wall right near the middle right. How did that form? Well, I'm pretty sure that's what I call a tree bite. And when a tree falls on a wall, if it's too far away, it scatters the stone. If it's too close, it leverages the wall sideways and apart. And I've seen a few pictures sent to me of that. But if it's just the right distance, that Goldilocks distance, it knocks the stones out, right at the trunk of the tree. And I think that's what happened here. Trees are the #1 killers of stone walls. And I love walls and I love trees. So it's kind of like a contest between two of your favorite things. And Robert Frost, when he wrote that famous poem, Mending Wall, he was insinuating and inferring and suggesting that frost is the main killer of walls, that sends those boulders tumbling in the sun. But in fact, it's trees, and I think he knew it, but he wanted it to be frost that would knock those walls down. Okay, and let's move on to the next one. But the biggest mystery of stone walls is why people are addicted to them. You know, and I suggest that we grok them. That's a word from Stranger in a Strange Land in 1961. I read that when I was, about that age, about, maybe 12, 13 years old. And I really, really liked it. I'm not a science fiction fan, but I love that word. And basically it's an intuitive understanding of things that borders on love. That's grok. And so I really grok stone walls. And the biggest mystery is why. Well, I could go on forever about that, but I'm sure you could come up with your own answers. I want to thank all of you, for coming. Whoops. I'm going to try and move my bar if I can out of the way. Yeah, there we go. There, I got it. Okay, so I've moved that participant bar. First of all of you for attending and showing such strong interest. If you have any questions, you can always contact me afterwards by email. And certainly Gina, who's rehearsed this twice. I got a new computer right between the time that we actually tested this out and actually had to test it out again, because for a big surprise, as my dean said, you need a new computer. Okay, now I like to always have a truth in advertising slide here, because sometimes I actually show up and give the wrong talk. And I want to make sure that doesn't happen. And if I said that I'm going to do something, I want to make sure. So I always go back and read what it is that I said I would do for you, so I don't get myself in trouble. And the description, basically, I'm supposed to decode mysteries of what? Well, the timing. Most stone walls are not colonial, not even in Harvard. They're actually from the New Republic to about the time of the Civil War. Of course, that's a complicated story. The magnitude is astonishing. There's about an estimated 240,000 miles of stone walls in New England. That's just ridiculous. That would wrap the earth 10 times and it would reach the moon. In this little patch of New England, it's like a plaid shirt with multiple layers and nested meanings. The builders, almost all of them were built. We don't have good numbers and good data and statistic, but nearly everything was built by the people on the land who owned the land. That is the farmers. It's the walls that look weird that get attention, the ones that are superlative, but the lion's share of the mass is just a local sort of human ecology experience that we resonate with because we know it intuitively. And they are, of course, an iconic landform, and I'm suggesting they're the signature landform of the region because they disappear to the north, they disappear to the west, and they disappear to the south. Why is that? We'll get to that later. Now, also, I showed up. It's me actually talking to you, not some avatar. And I like to introduce myself in 6 words. I'm a Midwestern native turned Northwestern geologist turned Northeastern academic. And the last 2 steps were all surprises. I didn't expect to be doing this when I had a life plan. But it turns out it's a really fun thing to do. So let's move on. Okay, I've got 4 takeaways for you. Number 1, think of a stone wall like a benchmark. It's a tangible, touchable reference datum. For what? For culture history, for the whole shebang, for the farming era, for the independence of not only our country, but the independent farmers that are creating the walls that are on their own property. And finally, it's really important for for Emerson's Nature, which is that fabulous 1836 essay that launched transcendentalism and the idea that nature might be something to really pay attention to. You could argue the origin of all land trusts down the road. And so here we have the wall that's in front of the Old North Bridge in Concord, and that's the wall that Emerson looked over when he wrote that book. And I'm pretty sure there's a connection. Signature landform, humans are a geologic agency, faster now than the rivers and faster than the glaciers were. We are moving more mass, now at the rate than did the ice sheets or all the rivers through geological time. Not the total mass, but the rate of the mass. And so it's okay to think of them as landforms. In fact, New Hampshire, the state geologist is, or the New Hampshire State survey, geological survey, is mapping them as landforms. And they're just really cool. There's also folk art in every single one of them. Management. You've got to ask the question, is this a farm property or something else going on? Is it public or private? Archaeology and architecture. I'll get back to this. I want you to walk away with this talk, with some better idea of how to manage them. And finally, an activity. I want you to go out wall watching. Just deck yourself out like you're going bird watching. Get yourself some binoculars, get yourself a guide, and go out and watch walls, and they're not going to fly away. For others, an outdoor activity might be aerobic chess. You know how to play chess. There's a bunch of different pieces. There's a strategy, there's a move, and what each piece does influences what the next piece does. And that's what people are doing when they're building stone walls. That is, the stone that you lay preconditions the next one you're going to lay. There's a strategy that is often intuitive. Okay, so just ignore this. I'm not trying to back up on my talk. I'm just got a light touch. So here's the here's the outline that I've got. It's a long one. So first of all, I want to talk about some misinformation. Cultural benchmark, I've already mentioned that. Then a close call. We almost lost a lot of our walls. Then I want to think about, why do we grok walls? Then I'm going to be clear about the signature landform piece and show you some maps. Then I'm going to go into the origin of stone walls. And that'll be a simple thing, one chapter for each stone by stone chapter, one slide for each, and we'll get through that. A little bit about wall watching. That is, how do you define a stone wall? How do you differentiate its parts? And how many kinds are there? The management will just be one simple slide. Then I've got some Harvard walls to show and think about and talk about. And then I'm going to send you off with an assignment. Okay. Okay, the misinformation. First of all, in the flyer, there's a clause that says stone walls laid by colonists, Native Americans, and enslaved people. I have no doubt that at least one member from each of those groups, built a wall up here in New England. The question is what's the ratio? I've had people really get mad at me when I didn't agree that the slaves built all the walls, or that the Irish built all of the walls, or the indentured service did all of the walls. People insist that they know how they were built and by whom. The fact is, we don't have information. But through inference and it's pretty clear that they are of the farm that they were built on. And I'm not talking about the Gilded Age reconstruction of walls, and I'm not talking about hauling walls in from everywhere or stone in from everywhere to build something. I'm talking about the lion's share of the 240,000 miles of stone walls that we have out there. Okay, cultural benchmark. What is a benchmark? This is at the Old North Bridge. A benchmark is a tangible, solid, stable, touchable reference point for elevation, XYZ. Not just elevation, but also horizontal. But we tend to think of them as benchmark elevations. So that's what a real benchmark is. And there's one on the North Bridge put in there by the state of Massachusetts. But I'd like to think that the stone wall, in this case on the National Park Service, Minuteman National Historic Park, I'd like you to think that there's a stone wall under there that is the tangible, solid, stable, touchable reference point for not only the history that they celebrate and the human ecology that I celebrate, but also the regional identity that I found as an immigrant from Alaska. This seemed like a really different place, but the stone walls were able to capture my attention and keep me. Having said that, let's move into the close call. Now, Oliver Bowles was just doing his thing in the 1930s. Who was Oliver Bowles? Well, he was the U.S. Bureau of Mines chief at Washington, D.C., a federal policy for mines. And his plan was to use the stone walls of New England as the perfect source for crushed stone to lay down on the roadways that we needed in 1939 that we didn't. I mean, we had bad roads in earlier decades, but this was about the time we started to get automobiles everywhere, and people were insisting on really smooth, good roads. And so the idea was he was going to take every roadside wall he could get his hands on, and turn them into roadbed and crush them up. And they were perfectly distributed because many of them were along the walls anyway. And here's an extraordinary machine. It's a stone crusher. All you got to do is feed stone wall in there, and it gets crushed out and spread on the road. And one of the most remarkable photos I've ever seen is the one on the right. That's from the U.S. Forest Service. Up in the White Mountain National Forest, they took stone walls apart to make a roadbed out of them. And then, of course, they just put gravel on top of that. This is just extraordinary to think that so many walls could have been disappeared by these ways. And they're not, people aren't being mean, they're just doing what they have to do in their era. There's crushed stone wall under the main turnpike. There's crushed stone wall, mostly on the way out to Cape Cod under Route 6. There's crushed stone wall in a lot of roads that were used, effectively for early automobile traffic. Again, we just don't know how many. We're trying to research, projects to get at some of the numbers. Okay, but I've seen plenty of strip mining myself. The wall in the upper right was a roadside wall on a scenic drive that I used to see on my trip to the beach down to Rhode Island. I'd take the beach hike every month or so. And what I noticed was that every time I took a trip, there were people harvesting stone walls and selling them. They were palleting them up like on the left and shipping them out to the west, where the price of New England fieldstone was a lot higher. So people were actually making money. They would need a permit to mine gravel, but you didn't need a permit, to mine whatever stone wall you had. And what this led to was, I received 3 solicitations, to sell the stone walls on my 4 acres here in Storrs, Connecticut, standard old pasture walls, like a lot of the ones in Harvard. By the way, I've been in Harvard quite a bit. It's a lovely town. And 3 times somebody sent me and said, we'd like to buy your stone walls. And I said, no way, no way. But I understand that some people did. And there were stone yards filling up at this time. And so I became a stump evangelist for Stonewall conservation after the publication of Stone by Stone, because they were really special to me, having never seen them as a kid. And the first product that came out was Stonewall Secrets. It's a book that we published in 1998, illustrated by a brand new artist named Gustav Moore, and it became a Smithsonian notable book for that year. And it's basically a mini lesson of New England history for kids, using stone walls as the library of stories. And so by all means, don't sell your stone walls, so someone else can use them. Now, that's not me giving you a command. That's me giving you a suggestion. I can't tell you what to do on your private property, but such is life. Okay, grokking walls, or really having that empathetic understanding that borders on love. And I'd like to start with Henry David Thoreau. He was in Harvard. In fact, his rock and mineral collection is stored in the Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, that hardly anybody knew about until I wrote it. He's known for his archaeological collections and his botanical collections and this and that. He has a rock collection and a mineral collection in Harvard, your town. And there's a quote. This is longer than I like on slides, but I'm going to read it. But you need to know what an aerolite is. That's basically a 19th century word for meteorite. Okay, that's an aerolite. And he's referring to the stone in Mecca. That's the black stone that Islamic tradition says fell from heaven, so Adam and Eve would have some instructions. And it's too sacred for a good examination, so we really don't know what it is. We know it's black and glossy and probably rich in magnetite. It's some kind of we just don't know, okay, because it's been broken up and there's only little pieces left and nobody gets to analyze it. But Henry Thoreau's had this comment: how it happens that we reverence the stones which fall from another planet and not the stones which belong to this heaven. He's talking about Earth. Are not the stones in Hodge's wall, that's your generic stone wall, as good as the aerolite at Mecca? Is not our broad backdoor stone of his house, and maybe your house, as good as any cornerstone in heaven? I just think that's a spectacular quote. And basically, he was all over that in the mid-19th century, that he would actually like to have people pay more attention to stones as the essence of where everything came from. Now, I blurbed a book called Good Fences for William Hubble, a spectacular photographer, a few years ago. And this was the blurb that I wrote on the back. And I thought it was appropriate for today because some of you are interested in the art. The stone walls provide the straight, hard, stony edges. They're frames needed to frame the rounder, softer, more patchy elements of forest, farm fields, and garden. The perfect blend of classical and romantic forms. That straight edge and then the fluffier stuff in between. I think that's what stone walls do. And I think that is why they are so beautiful on the landscape. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, well, maybe Manning owns this field and Smith owns that field, but nobody owns the landscape. And that landscape is framed. Those beautiful pictures are in frames made of stone. And finally, for a geologist, I just see the history of stone walls. Here's just a small, typical roadside wall in Woodstock, Connecticut, but it could be in Harvard. And there's a deep history there that I resonate with, because the whole history of the planet is in that image, in an abstract. Everything starts with dust, and then you turn it into rock. The rock, ventilates all the volatiles out to become our atmosphere. That's the air. And then that atmosphere condenses to become the oceans and the water. And then that water gives rise to life almost instantly. And that life gives rise to intelligence, billions of years later. So dust, rock, air, water, life, intelligence, ? That's essentially the short history, or the brief, as Stephen Hawking would say, the brief history of time here on planet Earth. And you can see it in that scene. So now we've moved into the next part of the talk. That's why we grok walls. Now we'll move into signature landform. This is it right here. I've had, 1,000 students see this thing. We walk by it and talk about it, on field trips. It's generic wall. Okay, so here we are with a digital elevation model on the left of New England, and the old Rand McNally, version of a shaded relief map on the right, whichever you're most comfortable with. But I think what you can see is, if you start at New York City on the western end of Long Island, you can see the Hudson and Champlain lowland and the St. Lawrence lowland. That is a very, very clear boundary in elevation and also geology. That's a suture where the new stuff, which is New England, the new mountain route, was attached to the old continent of North America, the proto-continent. And there's a break up there in northern Maine, the St. Johns River. You can see it comes right out. That's a topographically discrete and isolated region called New England. And of course, it's submerged on the right out of the Maine coast. That's land. It just happens to be submerged by shallow sea level. So New England is a coherent region that is smaller than the home state that I grew up in, Minnesota. Minnesota is 84,000 square miles. All of New England, including the Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire you've never seen, is about 71,000 square miles. So it's not huge, but it's very discrete. And from Maine to Minnesota, you can find sugar maples and church staples all the way. You don't lose them because New Englanders went west. Henry Thoreau said when he visited Minneapolis in 1861, he said, all of the lumbermen were from Maine and half of the men were from Massachusetts. That's what he said in 1861. But of course, then my relatives arrived in the late 19th century after the Homestead Act, the Thorsons and the Andersons and the Ericksons and all of my kin. And they basically settled those farms out there in the Midwest. And that's my basic native origin. A family homestead, starving immigrant arrives 3 generations ago to start farming. Okay, but there are three essential ingredients for our landscape, which is why we have stone walls. Number one, you need to have hard rocks. If you travel from Boston to Buffalo, New York, you're going to lose the stone walls as you climb up the escarpment there into upstate New York, on the other side of the Hudson River. And you lose them because you go from hard rocks of New England to the soft rocks of upstate New York, notwithstanding the Adirondacks. If you drive from Fairfield County, Connecticut, down in towards New Jersey on the other side of the Big Apple, you lose the stone walls. Why do you lose the stone walls when you head in that direction? You leave from the glaciated, the glacier bed stuff, to the non-glacial terrain. Staten Island is the southern limit of the last ice sheet. And so you lose the walls because you lose the glacial soils. You still have the other parts. And if you were in southern Maine, you'd have walls everywhere, especially the dairy farms that were common. And if you drive to the north and northwest up towards the lake country, you lose the stone walls. Why? You still got the hard rocks, you still got the glacier bottom soils, but what you're lacking is the farm tillage culture. And so there's the Venn diagram in the upper left there. You get stone walls only when all three of these co-occur. You must have hard rocks handled by the glacier on the bottom of the soil and pasted down or let down on the bed. And you have to have a farm tillage culture. And that's why you end up with so many stone walls in New England. And that is why they disappear in all directions. They disappear for different reasons in each direction. And that makes them not unique to New England. You can see stone walls in every state, but in New England, the problem is explaining their absence, whereas everywhere else it's explaining their presence. They're usually an anomaly elsewhere, but they're very, very common here. And that's why. We're the only region in the country that has those three criteria met. Now, the origin of stone walls. Well, this is a long story, and it's a fun story, and it's a story that gave rise to the book Stone by Stone that actually had 17 drafts, when I was working on it. There's a long story to that book called Draft by Draft. If you want to read it, it's on the Stonewall site. But there are 10 chapters, and these are the titles. And I'm going to briefly mention what the origin of stone walls is with each, and then I'm going to give you a slide for each. So England and New England. Both countries are related, not just because of the people who transported themselves from one side of the Atlantic to the other, but also because the landscapes of the northern and central England and Scotland are very similar to New England. They formed in the same mountain route, the same continuity. It's the same stuff. And they're glaciated as well. So you have a glaciated mountain route that's identical. Not identical, but close to it. And so there was a lot of familiarity to the people when they arrived here. The biggest difference was the climate, with New England being colder than England, but in terms of their agricultural technology, it was comparable. Making the stone. Just because you make stone down in the root of a mountain at a depth of 15 kilometers, doesn't mean it's going to get to the surface in one piece. It doesn't. It breaks up by jointing. There's an interesting story there, and then it's quarried by the ice sheets that are coming over. Quarrying meaning lifting blocks out of bedrock cliffs. And then finally, the dying of the ice sheet and the stagnation of its outer fringe and the letting down of that stone residue, to shroud the landscape in one piece. Burying the stone. It took 15,000 years, maybe 16,000. The ice sheet disappeared from Harvard, Massachusetts at about 16,000 years ago. And ever since then, the ants have been busy in the soil, and there's a million soil processes that will effectively concentrate fine-grained material above the stone and therefore bury it. Once you get it below the frost line in a fully canopy forest, it's going to stay there until something disturbs it. Taking the forest. This is about the farming enterprise. And the next chapter, Copious Stone, is about what happened. So the environmental impact is that by changing the climates, the microclimates of taking off the forest in New England over so much of the region, Massachusetts probably 70 to 80% deforested, you change the physics of the soil, and the stones came up to the surface through heave and through erosion and through other mechanisms, and they became a problem. And of course, chapter 6, that's why we build walls out of them. They store the stone, they define our territories, they're useful for fencing, and they are also folk art. Land abandoned. There was a culture change, a change in culture that was extraordinary. We became more urban and we became more wealthy. There's all kinds of complicated histories you can read about, but there was a biological curtain that shrouded the walls, because if you don't have a closed canopy forest, you get brush everywhere. And we could really not see the walls for a while as they were being grown over from abandoned land. And then this time is when people decided to mine them, especially the roadside one. But given enough time, by the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, urban wealth was on wheels, and they were buying properties up in Harvard and elsewhere throughout New England. And there was a colonial revival going on as well. And all of this factored together to kind of revitalize an interest in land that had been virtually given away just a few decades earlier. Even Teddy Roosevelt got involved in that, trying to, encourage and activate people to go back into these rural properties because nobody wanted them. But back to nature. After the environmental movement, so-called, after thinking about ecology and human ecology, you can now begin to see stone walls not so much as sort of aggressive architectural monuments on the landscape, but as something that just had to happen as a consequence of human ecology. And that makes it more interesting for me, getting to chapter 10, written in stone. That is, there's an authenticity, and there's the insertion of human beings into the landscape story, creating landforms without really knowing it, in the same way that, well, I'll just leave this for now. So they're real archaeology, and they're real authentic, and I'm just smack dab in love with them, and I suspect you are too. Okay, so now one slide for each chapter. England and New England. The rocks, the glaciers, and the climate are not that different. The dark line here is, of course, Pangaea, when all of the continents are smashed together, using the present countries for orientation. That black line is a common mountain range between Scotland and New York City. And they're the same rocks, the same sequences, including the Avalon terrain that came in and crashed and everything everywhere else. Okay, and here is on the left, that blue dot is Harvard. And Harvard sits on the edge of the older Merrimack terrain and this funny Neshoba terrain that came in and slid in here, just like Baja California is sliding up the West Coast. Well, this terrain slid in and got crammed to the northwest, by the older Avalon terrain, the granites that you see on the other side of Concord. So you got your granites to the north and Concord has the granites to the south, but in between we have much more complicated, almost corrugated rocks. And that's part of the story. And so here's Harvard on the detailed blow up of the state map. The tectonic grain runs from the northeast to the southwest. You don't need to worry about the units, but they're all high grade, ridgy, metamorphic crystalline sediments. And to the north, it's mostly granite. So Harvard has a combination of these sort of layered slabby rocks and blocky rounded ones. And I think you can see here, there's some stones in the upper right and that so-called wall. Those have been milled in the bottom of the glacier, turned round by being sheared underneath the ice. And the ones on the lower right, these are both Concord walls, by the way, but the one on the lower right, the slabbier stones, those were not milled. They were just part of the residue being yanked off of outcrops by the ice when it passed over that didn't get a chance to be milled into rounded stones. And so this is why we have a mix of stones in Harvard and everywhere else. But the key thing is that the glacial grain runs from the north-northwest to the south-southeast, and the tectonic grain runs nearly 90 degrees to it. And what that means is the glacier is coming up over bedrock ridges one after another, and it's an amazing way to bring and make the landscape stony. And that's why there's so many stones here. It has to do with the corrugation and the offset of the tectonic grain and the glacial grain. Now, the next chapter is burying the stone. This is an ant on my driveway, just burying that. If I didn't drive on it and I just let it be, I wouldn't be able to see my driveway after a decade. It would be covered with all of this stuff. Because the ant is not trying to build that hill. The ant is simply trying to make room to live its underground life. The ant hill, whatever beauty it has, whatever organization it has, is incidental to this particular species of ant. That's a disposal pile. And they're not ashamed of it, and they're not happy with it. It just is there. Now, this is a complicated slide. It's from the Harvard Forest, research that they've been doing. On the bottom is the chronology from the year 1600 when Euro settlement began to happen, and on the right is into the 20th century. And on the left, we are forest cover in percent. You'll notice that 90 degrees, all of the New England states, each of the lines there is a different New England state, and the average of the region is this dark brown line. Massachusetts is the blue line right here, the dark blue line. So basically, what's the story for settlement in Massachusetts on a state average? Forget the details of towns and cities. Basically, every New England state was fully forested except for ledges, beaches, and swamps and rivers and lakes. Anything that wasn't one of those is a forest. And so what happened is there's a very slow cutting away of the forest until about, I got to move the bar because I can't read the code there, until about 1770, about the time of the Revolution, is this line right here on the top. And the Erie Canal is on the right, that's 1825. And the peak deforestation of Massachusetts is occurring at about 1860. And Henry Thoreau caught it in his Walden, and he caught it in his writings in his journal. And so there's a slow deforestation in Massachusetts to about the Revolution, and then really rapid up to about the time of the Civil War. And that's the deforestation that gave rise to the walls, because since then it's been reforestation. I guess this is moving it forward. Yep, there we go. Okay, so now the next chapter is Copious Stone. This is a sketch from a geologist named Hitchcock in 1878. It's an exaggeration. Note there's a wooden fence there with all that rocky terrain. It kind of belies the idea that the stone is being used to make a fence. And on the right, what we have is a pasture. You can see what grazing animals do, to soils. They concentrate stone. And ours was a beef and milk and dairy economy. So there's a lot of stone walls that were built. Okay, so the next chapter in the book is building walls. And on the lower left, what we have is a map of Petersham, Massachusetts, and a map of frost heave polygons in the Canadian Arctic, where there's no human influence whatsoever. And the patterns look somewhat alike. And the bottom scene there is mud cracks on a pond in western Minnesota. And on the right, of course, is a classic band, just a waste pile of stone wall that qualifies as a stone wall. The upper left is a sorted rock circle, which is a completely natural phenomenon that works up to scales of almost half an acre in the Arctic. And so the basic idea of building stone walls is to shed the stone outward. And that outward push is also enhanced by the need to concentrate the stone on the edge so you don't waste space. And then once you got the stones there, you can basically begin to defend your territory and use it as an agricultural fence. But the initial concentration of stone is about managing an environmental impact of deforestation. And here's a spectacular shot of Block Island. And it's basically the pattern of stone walls in about 1880. It's an uncopyrighted picture that is just tells it all. And all of this now is oak scrub forest. I went back and took the picture, and it's just a sea of green, and it's the forest canopy. So there's a land abandoned in the next chapter. And look at this curtain on the left, that shroud or that archway or that arbor way is actually just vines and weeds and raspberries growing on that old stone wall. They're being hacked back now, because people want to see the wall again. But that wall was rendered invisible because it's in full sun and the brush just went at it. And that's what happened to stone walls all over New England. There was this curtain, sort of a phyto curtain, that just made them invisible until the trees got tall enough to shade out the undergrowth. And then look what you get on the right. The stone walls laced through our woods occur in the closed canopy forest, but we're paying more attention to them in the closed canopy forest than just about anywhere else. Here's a LiDAR image. This is actually a sort of a laser heavy computation taking out the tree cover, looking at the landscape right near where I live. This is just a patch of Yukon forest. It could be Harvard forest. It could be anywhere at one of your land trust properties. There's just stone walls everywhere, because if you look at the next slide, this is what it looks like today. It's just fully forested, but this is what it looks like when you look through the forest with this fancy device. They're everywhere. And then chapter 8, rural revival, urban industrial wealth. You got wheels, everybody can afford to get out and drive. There's a beginning of an environmental movement to be in the 1950s. Simon Schama writes this gigantic book on architectural history, fantastic book, and he ends it with a stone wall, because they're just amazingly enigmatic features. And this is the sort of the classic impressionistic images of stone walls. Now we're reviving an interest in stone walls. The Hudson River School painters didn't give a damn about them. All right. They painted them out of the scenes, and the Impressionists painted them into the scenes because they loved them. They couldn't get enough stone. That's because they're past the age when they had to do it. And of course, now back to nature. We're just romancing the stone. I mentioned this earlier. We're in the Anthropocene. I want you to think of them as Anthropocene landforms or early or pre-Anthropocene landforms. And there's a heroic element that we've added onto them being built, and I call it the Eastern cowboy. That is where the guy with a three-corner hat, and an ox and a plow is going to build all these walls in a heroic gesture. There's more to it. Yeah, there's some of that, but it's mostly human ecology. They just had to be, in the same way the Hills of Ants just had to be. Writ in stone, I've talked about this before, tangible history, living archaeology, they're viscerally evocative, and they're time machines for me and everybody. So with that, I'll say that I've explained that story. Now we'll get to wall watching. Now this guy at Minuteman National Park, is he standing in front of a stone wall? Some people would say no, that he's in front of a hybrid wall, but I would call that a stone wall underneath the wood. And of course, if you disappear the wood, we would have no problem calling it a stone wall. But let's just say that that what is a stone wall? It's not simple, especially when you get lawyers involved. Okay. In fact, you have to have 5 criteria in order to make a stone wall. I've tried to eliminate one of these criteria. What's the problem with the one on the lower left? It's not continuous. You see? What's the problem with the one on the bottom middle? It's not long enough. What's the problem with the one on the lower right? It's not high enough. What's the problem with the one on the, it has to be granular. So a stone wall has to be made of stone. It has to be continuous. It has to be elongate. It has to have a minimum height defined either by stone on stone or let's just say knee high. I'm not going to give you an exact figure. And it has to be granular. It can't just be a great big, cut of rock. And with that definition, a lot of things that are called stone walls don't end up being stone walls. On the left, this is a fascinating picture to me, sent to me by Colin, who works with me. This was a property in Vermont that was an auto junkyard, and the EPA instructed them to clear all of the chrome and body parts and everything out of there, but there was no regulation on what to do with the tires. So what did they do? They hauled them all to the edge and put it next to the wire fence that was there on the edge of the property. And that's pretty much the same story for the early part of stone walls and the primitive ones, not the beautiful architectural walls, but like the one on the right. That meets all 5 criteria. The one on the left meets all of the criteria of the definition of a stone wall, except it's not made of stone. So the fundamental unit in the wall taxonomy, if you're going to start wall watching, and I'm working up on publishing this fall and winter in the journal Historical Archaeology. I finally got it to submittable stage. The fundamental unit, as in biology, is the cell, and in stone wall science, it's the segment. And segments sum up to be walls in the same way that cells add up to be tissues. Okay, the land parcel is the next stage up, and the landscape is the next stage above that. I could go forever, but I don't think I will. There's a hierarchy of form. There's the project area, the parcel. You might have a field, call it a field if you like. Then there's the wall around 2 or more of the field. And then there are segments in the wall. And then there's the datum that begins it all. They have coordinates. They have contacts. They can be abutting. They can be selvage. They can be gradational. There can be gaps. There can be bends between segments in a wall. And the terminations, there can be tips or junctions, T, L, X, whatever. And the settings, they can be on, outcrop, or upland, and it just gets complicated from here, but we don't need to worry about that. The structure of a stone wall, there's a line, there's a top, there's a face, there's an end. They can be mound-shaped, triangular, trapezoidal, panel, or asymmetric. There are layers, tiers, main, cap, foundation, courses, or uncoursed. A brick wall is nicely coursed, but it has only one tier, as long as the design stays the same. Stone walls are usually not coursed, and they're usually one-tiered. The matrix, a dry stone wall, doesn't have one, but you can have harding, they can be chinked, mortared. There's a lot of terminology that I'm working on. And classification is the key piece. What is the wall we're looking at here? It's a double wall, okay? But it's more than that. I sort of cooked up the stone wall domain because theoretically you can only define a stone wall as a classified taxon by carving it out from something else. So I needed to make the domain so that I could make it be a class of the domain. A wall is the class of a domain, and there's a family of freestanding walls within the stone domain. And then there are double walls that are an example of freestanding walls within the stone domain. So this is how taxonomy works. And the difference between taxonomy and typology is a taxonomy is a rule-driven, yes or no, thumbs up, thumbs down, dichotomous decision. You don't make any subjective judgments. It's a rule-driven classification. Unlike a typology, like Tints of Music, that's a typology. They're bins that you sort things in. I'm talking about a rule-driven classification so that if you follow the rules, everybody comes up with the same classification. These are the basic families within freestanding walls. There's enclosed, closing, flanking, freestanding, blocking, and supporting. And it gets complicated, but I just wanted to show you some examples. And even though I'm using verb tenses like blocking, what I'm really trying to do is describe them objectively. That is, a blocking wall will look this way. And it's working. It's just too complicated to go into here. Examples, I could go on forever here, but the stone, what's the shape of the stones, the size, the lithology, the source, and the order. In the upper left there, those are stacked field stones made of granite and gneiss. The size is hefted, and they're basically ball shaped. So you can begin to use this language, and it really keys you in to paying more attention. Good, I got done with that. Now we can go on to the fun stuff, the management, which is actually not the fun stuff because it's always controversial. Okay, and there's no way that I can tell you what to do or not to do. You have your own land trust. I'm a member of a land trust that I'm active in, and I really I know that the discussions are long and deep. But I think that that any stone wall in the closed canopy forest of New England is essentially an artifact. You know, it's busy being archaeology, not architecture. But I think a roadside wall or one in your patio or behind or in your town green, you know, that's architecture. It's busy being architecture. And if it's archaeology, let it be. And if it's architecture, you know, maintain it in the tradition that the person who built it originally would probably want it. And try to retain the form instead of some garish Dalmatian style wall. I've seen a beautiful stone wall out in the Berkshires turned into a Dalmatian polka dot wall with white quartz boulders and otherwise black stone. And I thought it looked hideous. Okay, but let me go back to a few other dichotomies. Determine if it's an active farm or an abandoned farm. Almost everything is abandoned farm. But if it's an active farm, I think that the farmer should just be able to do what they want on their active farm if it's about managing the property. Are you going to use objective, scientific, you know, empirical, quantitative criteria, or are you going to be subjective? Decide on that balance. What about two property owners? And the wall is essentially the divide between their two properties. You can't take your half of the wall. I mean, what are these issues? They've come up over and over again. I've been involved in court cases on that. And public and private, roadside versus not roadside. It's just really a lot of issues. And take a look at the one on the left. I mean, in the red boxes, you can see there's two very, very different styles of walls there. You know, is that desirable? Is it undesirable? I mean, we need to start asking these questions. We don't want monotony, but at the same time, you know, we don't want willy-nilly stone weirdness all over Harvard. Now, some of the slides that you sent. This is the first one on the Burgess Brown land. It was suggested it might be a Manitou animal effigy of a turtle or something. And I would say, well, it could be. But before I get into any kind of discussion of that, I'd like to talk about 4 different ways of knowing. And these are, I blurbed a book that is just coming out, and it's by Tim Ives. He's a state archaeologist of the state of Rhode Island. He's given more thought to this than anybody I know. And I had the opportunity to read his book and blurb it. And essentially, this is the essence of my blurb. There's 4 ways of knowing what that object is. If we have a tradition that tells us what they are, we're knowing what it is out of habit. If we just use spiritual eminences or energy or mysticism or so deep knowledge that we can't articulate, it's evocation or the feel. If it's science, we can prove why it is there using science. Science answers the question, you know, how do you know? It says because I can prove it. And faith answers the question, I know it because I know it. It's the ultimate way of knowing. So we really have to separate ways of knowing, and philosophers are very good at this. But this is my simple version of that. And to my sense is that the key questions then on the next page would be, go there with an open mind and look at it. Honor the parsimony principle, that is the simplest explanation, given competing ones, is likely to be true, and allow for idiosyncratic expression. I mean, when I was just a teenager, I did all kinds of stuff just for the hell of it that made no sense, you know, and allow for that out in the woods of New England. The key observations for me looking at this are, you know, is this unique, or is there a population of these things? If it's a population, are they aligned in some direction, or are they random? Are they only on boulders, or are they off the boulders? And this is preempted space. Nobody's going to move that boulder. So why not use it to stack waste stone on? You know, I mean, that's an explanation. And then there's also the surface patina, or the weathering, or the microbial rind on it. What is, you know, does it look the same? How old does it look? We can start to do surface exposure age dating, but it gets complicated. So I just want to say, I'm not going to answer the question, but I'm going to say there's a way to get at it. I'm almost done here now. The Gillette land near Horse Meadows Knoll. This is ledge, and you can see the jointing in that ledge. You can see a rounded, what looks like a boulder let down on the landscape. You can see the roughness of the bed, you know, a horizontal grain on those ledges. That's really perfect country for letting the glacier incorporate rock materials, which is a subject that we don't need to get into right now. There's a whole set of physics for quarrying of blocks underneath an ice sheet that we can talk about for days, but we won't. Here's the one that I used in the opening slide. I'm going to classify this. Whoops. I'm going to classify this. I got to move the picture, my picture out of the way. Okay, it's certainly made of stone, so it's in the stone domain, as opposed to the fiber domain or the wood domain or the metal domain. It's a wall. It's freestanding because it has two sides. It's a single wall. And the subtype of the single wall, it's a panel because it's basically the same width at the bottom and at the top. Okay, and it's not the triangular classic shape of the single wall. How many segments are there? There's only one segment that I see from left to right. It's one thing. There are 3 tiers. There's a bottom tier that's horizontally laid with a very sharp line. And there's a top one made of tablet stones that some of which have fallen apart. So that I would consider a capstone tier of tablet stones. And then there's this mess in the middle that to me is a 3rd tier. There are no courses. There's no matrix in it. The lithology is bimodal, meaning you have granitics and you have sort of slate foliated metamorphics. You have bimodal shape. You have rounded ones and flat ones. And you have hefted sizes. There's a few one-handers in there, but most of them are two-handers or hefted stones. And the degree of order is it's actually laid. It's not dumped and it's not stacked. It's carefully laid because people thought about where the next stone would go. And that's what I can say about it. Now, what's the purpose? Well, we can go on. I think there's quite a bit of folk art in this particular image that you might see if you weren't looking for it. And then the other images I don't have any study of, but that's a nicely laid wall there with the same general form, although not as nicely as expressed. Again, it's nowhere near a fence. That's the height of the average stone wall in New England. It's roughly knee high. Here we have a missing gap. I'm guessing you have foundation stones dragged there by oxen or something, and then you're missing the stones on the top. There's somebody there that knows this wall a lot better than I do because they contributed it. And I can't say anything more about that. Okay, Jacobs Gate Road. I couldn't make a lot out of these. Somebody sent a nice map and a sketch, and I tried to figure out what was going on here. I see a wall coming down the hill here, and I circled it in red on the left, and I tried to circle what I thought was the appropriate walls on the sketch. But basically, this is a real tumble down wall coming down a ledge somewhere in Harvard. And this is close to an embankment or a retaining wall. I don't think it is, but it's close to that because it's kind of nestled into the slope. Sometimes this happened just by sediment flux from the top end. And now these are one-handers. And usually when you see these, it's an upgrade of properties, where the tolerance for what's a clean field, went up when you went to mechanical harvesting. Now, again, there's no written document to say why this is, but I can speculate and then work on a hypothesis to decide that scientifically. Okay, and here's another picture. I just couldn't make much of this, but here it is, Harvard. And finally, I'm near to the end, your assignment. Okay, first of all, Gina asked me to give you an assignment, and she's really spot on for that. Here's your assignment. Get a pair of binoculars, get a copy of Exploding Stone Walls. I'm sorry, Bloomsbury, Harry Potter's publisher, bought mine and just decided to let it go out of print. And I own the rights, so I think I'm going to be updating and spreading this out a little bit later, but I'm not quite there. In the back of this book is a taxonomy and a life list. So start your life list of stone walls. Most of this is on the Stonewall Initiative website, which you can see on the right. Just go to if you just Google, Stonewall Initiative, it'll pop up on any Google message. And there's a whole description of taxonomy and taxa there. You could have lots of fun and try and decide what your wall is. It's not a robin or a tanager or a duck. I mean, you can make that distinction because you're used to identifying birds, but go out there and look at your wall. Is it a double? Is it a single? Is it a panel? Is it a band? Is it a budding wall? Just go have fun. See if you can describe the stones and see if you can infer the classification of a wall. The second thing is read to a child. There's this book that my wife and I published in 1998 that I mentioned earlier. Every stone, has a story. And think of that wall as a library of earthen books, and if you teach yourself how to read that, your life gets enriched. And so this story of Stonewall Secrets is, the secret is the meteorite hidden in the corner of the wall, by the way. That's the giveaway. But the basic idea is that the kid, the grandfather is me. He's solicited, for a, will you sell your walls? And the kid says, well, why not? And then grandpa takes him out on a walk, and the kid slowly becomes immersed in the story contained within the walls. And in the end of the story, of course, we leave it open, but there's no way he's going to sell the halls after he inherits that property. The one on the left, I just have to tell you, that's one of my favorite wall pictures. That's a hydrothermal vein, it was coated with jasper, not paint. That's just like quartz, cryptocrystalline quartz in the red variety paints the side of a volcanic clast, here in Connecticut. And that's just a wicked cool, surface on a stone. And I think that's my last one. Yep. So that's my thank you slide. We came back to the one you have. And then the oddest stone wall in Harvard is this one. Okay, so that's me being done, but ready to answer questions. Sorry if I went over time. I didn't even watch.
Great, great. Thank you, Thor. My head is spinning. I have so much information that's come at me in the last hour. So we do have a lot of questions. Let me ask one clarifying question. So we're all going to go out. We're gonna look at our stone walls. Should we then sort of take our notes to the Stonewall Initiative website where you have all of your taxonomy? Will that help us start to classify our wall?
Right now, probably, if you were to do that out in Harvard and take some notes and some observations and send them to me, I will archive them in a folder, and then I will make some sense, out of them, after they're all done dribbling in, and report back to you. How's that?
That sounds really
exciting. If you were to attach a picture to that email, then I would be able to make my own diagnosis and help you with yours. And then what can happen is we could do a little citizen science project here. Everybody can have a different piece of a land trust property and go out and find out what kind of walls are there. And I could help you figure that out, down the road. But as they come at me, I'll just put them in a folder and I'll get to it, whenever I can. Great. But it won't be forever.
So for those of you that are participating, we will have Thor's talk on our website very soon. So a lot of the classifications he's taught us, you'll be able to reference those. If you send, we will also post his contact information so that you'd be able to reach out to him directly, or you can send any questions or photos or descriptions to sites@harvardconservationtrust.org, SIGHTS, and we'll make sure that they get forwarded to him as well. So questions. One attendee asks, I'm still having trouble understanding how deforestation led to building more stone walls. Is it because deforestation led to stones getting pushed up or being more exposed?
Both. I can be more specific. And I spent a fair bit of time at the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in Hanover, New Hampshire, thinking about this and watching movies and looking at this, at the studies. Basically, the idea is Timothy Dwight, who traveled New England in the early 19th century, and the governors of your states were very familiar with the lay of the land in the forest, said that you can go out in February and you can poke a stick through the forest, the snow crust, and the ground isn't frozen beneath the forests. It's just not frozen. There's a crust beneath up in the organic horizon, and below that you really don't have common frost. But if you go to an open pasture, it'll be frozen to a depth of, say, let's just say 30 centimeters or a foot. Okay, and let's say you go to a hard packed trail, it might be frozen twice that. So the idea is that the nature of the land, whether it has organic material in it, whether it's pure mineral soil, whether it's trampled or whatever, is going to change the thermal conductivity of the soil in a way that will allow more stones to be heaved up. Essentially, what I'm arguing is that for thousands of years, we've been progressively burying the stone in a mantle that was maybe a foot and a half thick. And then what happened is when we cleared the forest, it became colder. The wind had greater access. The snow didn't insulate it as well. We were able to freeze much deeper than we were able to freeze before, and reach stones that have been hiding for thousands of years. And they began to heave up through the soil. In addition to that, the ground froze deeper, so surface runoff, did more erosion. In addition, we grazed the land, overgrazed them, the pastures. And so what happened is we removed the organic material, which drove up the thermal conductivity. The net effect is to freeze the soils deeper and enhance the rate of frost heave and surface erosion, which concentrates stone, which then needs to be managed, usually by scuttling it aside and then later building stone walls. If you have just a few pennies, you can't do much with it. But if you have a million pennies, you can do a lot with them. You see, and so that's the same basic idea, is that if you throw a pumpkin over the fence, you know, it's going to be gone the next year. But if you throw a stone over the fence, it's going to be there the next year below the one you just threw on it. You know, and if you just keep that up for a generation, you're likely to have a residue or a band below a fence line that will begin to nucleate the stone walls. Some were clearly built right off the get-go by somebody who wanted to mark a boundary, of course. But the vast majority were sort of slowly started in higgledy-piggledy fashion.
Interesting. Teresa Ledoux is asking, why did landowners make double versus single walls, capped walls, etc.?
Oh, that's a case-by-case story. The generic most common wall in New England is the sort of trapezoidal or triangular shaped single wall, also called a farmer's wall, a pasture wall, an anything wall. And basically, this is just the simple stack without trying to lay or being careful about it. And but quite common are double walls, and these usually they hold more stone, they look nicer, there's more architecture in them than the more common single walls. And so these are people trying to either build a better wall or make it look better or show up the neighbor or build a stronger wall or have it hold more stone. I mean, one category of walls is called the broad wall, and you've probably seen them. You know, they're the width of a road. And basically, this is just getting rid of stone. It's like you build a wall on one side, and then on the other side, and in between, you fill it with rubble. And that way it looks decent from both sides, but you just don't have a pile of rubble on the edge of your field. And that's called a broad wall. And a broad wall is anything broader than is necessary for structurally supporting a double wall. And why do they get capstones? Again, it goes into architecture, it goes into folk art. But the typical wall that is sort of like the pioneering farming wall, the moving forward wall, not quite established, not a really wealthy property, is basically every segment. There's lots of segments, and every load, they grow load by load, and they're built by different people, so they look different all the way around the property. The classic estate wall that you might find in Harvard that was resettled in the Gilded Age or in the early 20th century is a really nice looking wall that might go for, you know, around a multi-acre property. When you see that, that's not an early farm wall. You know, that's a wall where they used the stone that was there, and somebody had an idea for a specification of a good wall, and they just ran it all the way around the property. Mm-hmm. So those are very different. The former is built by the people living on the farm with income and money from the farm. The latter are built by money that came from somewhere else. You know, early oil wells or the copper barons or the manufacturers or whoever they are that has enough money to hire a crew to rebuild walls. And there wasn't very many farmers that were able to do that.
Those are going to evoke images as we're looking at our walls now. Claire Perry is asking, how long does it take for lichen to grow on walls? And I would add, does the lichen damage the walls?
Oh, yes, it can. I mean, basically the lichen is trying to eat the rock, you know, and the reason it's there is it's also bacteria on the walls. There's a rind or a patina. I just use the word patina to describe a very complicated set of properties on the walls. And yes, you're doing granular disintegration of those walls, every lichen. They'll eventually disappear. And that's one thing wonderful about them. They give you a clock to measure the human lifespan on. The millennial scale clock is what you see there. Now, how long does it take for lichen to grow? Well, lichens are pretty good up to about a century. But once you get to be about a century in age, it's the effects of shading and disease and sort of, you know, microclimate begin to dominate, you know, the growth of the lichens. So early on, it's just the lichen beginning to spread on a clean wall. You know what a wall looks like when it's freshly built out of quarry stone. There isn't a lichen on it. And then you say, oh, look at that lichen. It's about the size of a dime. You know, and then you can manage that. There's no good calibrated curve for the growth rate of lichens because the microclimates are too different. You know, shade and sun and nutrient and you know, the coexistence with bacteria and animals that eat lichens and so forth. It's just complicated. It works great in Lapland and Arctic Norway, where you can have a 10,000-year-old lichen just identified by the diameter of the growth. But, down here in New England, that's hopeless once you get past about a century.
Okay. Bruce Monday, who is logging in from Australia tonight,
Oh my.
is asking, would you define as dry stone a wall built stone on stone with mud as mortar? And perhaps over the years, all the mud has eroded away?
That's totally possible. I mean, I don't think that mud was used widely as a mortar to put these stones together. That could happen in other climates and be very, very useful. I mean, what is adobe except basically sun-baked mud? And that makes a perfectly decent building. Or laterites, those are basically the B horizons of soils that are used to build structures in South Asia. So yeah, mud can work, but here it tends to wash out pretty quickly. The basic standard here is that you either have a dry stone wall or a dry laid wall, and you have a wet stone wall, which is a mortared wall. And there's all kinds of variations in the mortared wall, but mortar just doesn't work. We've got acid rain, and there's a reaction that takes place between the stone, which also generates its own acid with the acid rain, and mortar just comes unglued. It's like periodontal disease of the mortar around every stone. I've seen them fall apart to the point where they rebuild the wall and they use the broken up mortar as fragments to keep the wall going. It just doesn't work. And a mortared wall doesn't flex the same way one of these does. This is more like a chain instead of a bar. You see, when you get the heaving that's different and the expansion and contraction.
All of us who live here we've experienced trying to have mortar walls.
Yeah,
around here.
it really is. It works for a while. Of course, the chemists are getting very good at making better mortar, but it just doesn't work. And mortar is a really interesting. There's an interesting history that I haven't had a chance to get into, but I really like the dry stone wall that is well built. Mud, I think that's an interesting idea. People used to fill them with dirt, and but then the dirt would just disappear. There's a lot of rubble filled walls. Most double walls are filled with rubble in the middle. Not all, but most.
Paul B is asking, can a thigh-high wall really hold in sheep or cattle?
No. And that's the really interesting thing, is if you look at the town of Mansfield here, where I live in Connecticut, it's like any rural New England town. The item, 153 years, fencing came up at the annual town meeting. All right. It was really, really important. And the standard fencing height that was by the town, I don't know what Harvard's was, but in the 19th century, there would have been a standard height. That you needed. It's always at least 3.5 feet. It's 4 to 5.5 feet, depending on where you are. The average being about 4 feet. And you know how high that is. It's the standard 4-board equestrian fence. That's how high a legal fence was through most of the Revolutionary and early American and antebellum periods. It was basically the height of an equestrian fence. And I think you know what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And hardly any of our walls reach that height. Okay. And if you look at a place that has sheep in it and there's a stone wall around it, there's probably some electric fence or some barbed wire up at the top, no matter where you go. And sheep basically evolved to climb stone, to escape predators by climbing stone. And so I don't think, this wall here is not going to hold a sheep in. It might hold a cow in, but not the frisky cow, only the one that we bred to be so docile that all they can do is produce milk and meat. It's really pretty interesting. And I think that the sheep is overrated. And in Stone by Stone, I argue that the cause effect is mostly inverted. John Muir called sheep woolly locusts, and because when they let go, they'll eat anything, goats especially. But the basic idea is that sheep are so hard on pastures that they produce the stone that then is used around a sheep field, as opposed to you build a fence out of stone to hold the sheep in, because it doesn't work anyway. A sheep would just laugh at this, I think. But of course, they bred sheep with short legs,
So someone, Amy Mahoney is saying in grade school that a teacher told her that on a nature trail that certain walls had holes in them because livestock wouldn't jump over the fence if they could see through them.
There's part of that gets into the whole lace wall thing that I went to Martha's Vineyard, where they're supposedly known for their lace walls. And a lace wall is one where you can see through it. Okay, it's very, very difficult. It would be impossible to build a wall out of rounded stones, okay, if you didn't have little ones without making a lace wall, because you're going to have 26% porosity by volume, just because the round stones don't fit together. And you're going to have, so the more blocky and more round your stone wall is, the more likely you will be able to see through it. It's more a function of shape. But I've heard about 5 reasons for why we have lace walls. One is we want the wind to be able to blow through them, so that it doesn't blow the wall down. That sheep are intimidated by sort of walls that look like they're about to fail. But also the physics is pretty good. If you want to walk on ice, you get those crampons, the sharp edges, because you want to concentrate your stress. Point on plane is a really strong way, to hold up a wall. So sometimes the strongest wall is actually the one that looks airy, but it isn't, because you're concentrating the weight of the stone on a single point as opposed to on a frictional surface. And so those are the different explanations for certain lace walls. And my concern as a scientist is that watch out when you overgeneralize, what is or is not a lace wall or one you can see through. And then also put it to a test. And I haven't seen any good tests on it, good reasonable experiments on it. And I would argue that Rudyard Kipling wrote a book called Just So Stories. How the elephant got its trunk and the rhinoceros its horn and the leopard its spots and so forth. And the argument there is just because something is logical doesn't make it true. So to your teacher walking through saying that they built the walls with holes in them, that may be, but I haven't seen any good proofs of it.
Mm-hmm. So we have time for one question, and I think what I'm going to do is blend 3 or 4. We have a theme, and folks are asking. They're asking a question along the same lines. How egregious is it to fix the stone wall in my property? Is it bad form to add stones to existing walls? If some stones fall down from the stone walls in my yard, should I put them back up? Should I let nature take its course? So this is, you and I talked about this a little bit last week. It's a bit of a hot topic here in town as folks are thinking through this beautiful feature in our town. Do we touch them? Do we not touch them?
Well, let me just say that it's your choice. Let's say you have a land trust property, one of your properties, you guys get to decide what to do with it. I think a town should have an ordinance on how to manage and how to deal with stone walls. There's the case of somebody went to a town in Southeast Connecticut and cleared all of the walls off of 26 acres to sell them out west because there was demand for the stone. And I just think that's wrong because they're harvesting the landscape. That's strip mining. If you take that wall away in the picture, that's strip mining. It's really what it is. Now, what should you do? I think if it's architecture, that the original builder, if he tried to build a decent wall, by decent, I mean, with, laid rather than just dumped or stacked, tried to have a wall and it's falling apart. I think that person, we would honor the past by rebuilding that wall, back to where it was, using the stones that are there. I think that if it's in the closed canopy forest, like the one we're looking at here, that's busy being archaeology. And I wouldn't try to rebuild that in this scene. On a roadside, I might, but it would depend on the case. And so I think what you need to do is give it lots of thought. I'd be happy to help you get through it. There are some pages or some quotes on the Stonewall site that deal with management. If you go to the tab on management on the Stonewall Initiative site, there are some tips there and some stories and some sample ordinances. I'm helping Fitchburg right now. I helped Harwinton before. I helped Lincoln, Rhode Island, get a Stonewall ordinance. I think it's time to get one in town. And then I also think it's time for a land trust to figure out what to do. So the answer is, would I bring stone in, to help from outside to help embellish a wall? It would depend on the case. I would say never in this case that I'm looking at. That to me is someone's folk art that is coming apart, stone by stone, which is the title of the book, all right, in a closed canopy forest. That's different for me if it's on a roadside and it's a nice looking architectural wall that's falling apart. So that's going to be a case-by-case decision. I'd be happy to help you with it. And I think it's a really important and an excellent question. So I'm glad that your people are thinking about that. There's no easy answer, but the simplest version is that walls are either going to be architecture or archaeology. And it's kind of hard to be both all at once. And you just need to make the decision on what to do. And it's your decision.
Thank you.
It turns out that New Hampshire did have an ordinance on stealing stone walls, so they raised it from, it was $15 fine for stealing a stone wall. I've got some sort of sob stories about walls that are being stolen and dismantled and so forth that I won't get to, but it's a real serious issue. The strip mining of stone walls and the theft and disappearance. And I also think it's a problem when you overbuild them. I would say honor the past. I would say the easiest question is, if you're going to want to know what to do with a stone wall, look at the nearest neighbor, for half a kilometer in all directions. What do the walls generally look like, and try and match that.
Okay, that's really great insight.
Rather than just have some kind of arbitrary decision. So there's like an average. And if there's a gradient in your wall morphology from, let's just say, Harvard over to Williamstown, for example, let's say there's a gradient in what the form of a wall should be. In each of those places, you should be able to, swing a theoretical circle, like a kilometer radius. And what do the walls look like in that radius? And then try to match it if you insist on rebuilding it. But when they're in closed canopy forest, my bias is to let them be, because they give us a clock by which we can judge the passage of time at the millennial scale. I'm pretty good at the geological scale of, eons and millions of years and so forth. I mean, I'm really steeped in that stuff. And I'm also pretty good at normal history time, like most people are. But it's the millennial scale time that we have trouble with. And I think the stone wall coming apart stone at a time at the millennial scale is really something for us to begin to appreciate, because we're not going to be around forever. And the walls will outlast us.
Wow, lots for us to think about. Whether we are looking at these stone walls from a folk art perspective, a historic perspective, a geologic perspective. This has been really eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a lot of fun.
Everyone be sure to visit the Stonewall Initiative. It's hosted by the University of Connecticut. You can just Google the Stonewall Initiative and you'll find Thor's blog there.
Yep. And I will say that it's not super active because I'm doing about 1 million things right now, but it's still a worthwhile source to tap into. And every once in a while, I'll put a blog item up there.
Beautiful. The Harvard Conservation Trust will be bringing you more events like this in our speaker series. The trust is funded, or this land trust here in our town is funded exclusively through your donations and volunteer efforts. We're quickly approaching our 50th anniversary, so stay tuned for events to celebrate this important milestone for us. If you appreciate the natural beauty like our stone walls, as well as the wildlife that we have here in Harvard, please act generously when you receive that email to renew your membership. If you don't know the status of your membership, just email info@harvardconservationtrust.org. And our team will let you know your status. Your donation goes to protecting land for the wildlife and for recreation use here in town for all of us. So have a great rest of your night, and thanks everyone for coming. Thor, thank you.
Bye everyone. Good luck with your assignments.